Thanks for having me. It's really good to be with you, City Light East, with my family. Such a joy to see a growing 4-year-old church. Didn't realize. Happy birthday. So almost at school, growing up a little bit. But it honestly does fill my heart to see you guys at regular intervals and see what God is doing. And it's just our joy as a family. Psalm 23 has a special place in my heart, and I hope it does in yours, or at least it will after this morning. Psalm 23 is one of the better known Psalms, and one of the first thoughts that came to my mind when Carl said, "Can you preach Psalm 23?" was my dad in 2020. He was in the last stages of his battle with cancer, and it was that COVID year. And he was in hospital, and he wouldn't leave hospital after this moment. And he would read Psalm 23 over and over again. And it's pretty short, so you can memorize it. And as his brain was starting to have more cancer grow and lose its function, he had a dream. And in the dream, he heard Jesus say to him, "Just be a sheep. Just be a sheep." And it was reminding him, of course, of the words of Psalm 23, because if you believe the first verse, if you really believe the first verse, your life will be okay. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So we're going to take my dad's advice this morning. We're going to learn what it is to be a sheep and find out 3 things about this shepherd from Psalm 23. So the first thing we learn in Psalm 23 is the shepherd's provision. The shepherd's provision. Now, I want you to understand that this is a song that came out of the heart of King David. King David was one of the great kings of Israel, but before he was king, he was a shepherd. He tended sheep. He looked after them. He knew what it meant to care for, to protect and provide for sheep. And consistently in the Bible, God is referred to as a shepherd, and his people are referred to as sheep. If you've ever spent time around sheep, you know that people actually resemble sheep more than you think. It just happens that way. But David's experience of God as his shepherd became the words for this song. His experience was then shared and written down and recorded for us to be a declaration, even if you're not living it, even if you're not experiencing it, that you can get this truth and work it into your heart. That you can live a life where you trust God's provision, where you say, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." In the church community, this body of Christ, this temple of the living God, we can say together, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." In Luke 15, Jesus talks about a shepherd looking for lost sheep. Sometimes it's called the parable of the lost sheep, but I like to call it the parable of the searching shepherd, because it shares us again the heart of God. God is a shepherd, but God is a shepherd who's looking for lost sheep. And so that means this morning that wherever you're at, whether you're feeling close to God, this is good news and a good reminder to go deeper with your good shepherd, or whether you are not sure where you're at with God or you feel distance from God, this psalm is God showing his heart to pursue you. God is not someone who waits for us to get our life together. God is someone who goes after lost sheep. Again, in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus is looking upon crowds of people, and it says he sees them like sheep without a shepherd, harassed and helpless. And what does the Bible tell us about Jesus' attitude? He has compassion on them. So Jesus knows what it's like to see people who are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, and he's looking for them. He wants you to know him as it is revealed in Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." This text is interesting because the first 3 verses essentially tell us that God is a great provider. So for sheep, he makes them lie down in green pastures. He leads them beside still waters. So that's like he takes care of our needs. And we can remember every day that everything we have, everything that we've been given is a gift from God. That's why we do things like say grace or give thanks at meal times. That's an important, consistent reminder, or at least it should be, that God is giving these things to us. He's the ultimate provider. It goes a bit deeper though in verse 3 because it said, God restores my soul. So God cares for our body. God also cares for our soul. He does things like leads us in paths of righteousness for his name's sake, as it says in verse 3. God gives us a shape to our life if we entrust ourselves into his shepherding care. Now, this is interesting because God is in the business of providing not just for his people, but for everybody. Acts 17 tells us as the Apostle Paul is preaching in Athens. He's preaching the message of Jesus to an unbelieving world. And he says, God gives to us life and breath and everything. So God doesn't just provide for his people, but he actually provides for everyone. But there's something different going on here in the text. There's something deeper going on here in the text. I was actually listening to a podcast. It's called 15 Minutes with the Boss. And it was talking about a guy who owns a $10 billion company in Australia, a CEO. And his job is essentially to dedicate his life now to creating anti-aging and wellness in the world. And so he set up this anti-aging clinic in Melbourne where you have to pay very big dollars to get into it, and he will help you fight back the powers of aging. I don't think it's worked yet, and I don't think it ever will, unfortunately, because the mortality rate's 100% still. I don't think that's going to change ever. But one of the things that he has said about his daily practice is he has a gratitude journal. So every day, this man, his name's Peter, every day he writes 3 things that he's thankful for, and that helps him be reminded of the good in the world rather than focusing on the bad. But it's astonishing, isn't it? Because if you really think about it, once you've cracked $1 billion in your net worth and you own a $10 billion company, you'd think you'd already know that you've got things to be grateful for every day. But our human heart doesn't work that way. Our human heart works in such a way that we're always looking up at the things we don't have and the things we want and the people we aspire to be and the job that we'd like and the spouse that we'd like, the children that we'd like, or we're looking down and feeling better because they don't have as much as me. And that's the way our human heart works. And so Psalm 23 is pointing us to something more than just provision, because God is already providing everything you have in your life. He's going deeper and he's doing something called contentment. It's deeper than gratitude. Because gratitude, you have to get out a journal, you have to write things down. It's not a bad habit to have, but contentment is a state of soul. Contentment is believing the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I was chatting with a friend just 2 weeks ago, and he was saying he's got a lot of peers who, they're up to their 3rd house now. And he's like, I've got to get my act together. I've got to buy, got to get my 2nd and 3rd house and catch up to my peers. And I said, yeah, that's great. But, the people with 3 houses, they're trying to catch up to the people with 10 houses. And it just goes on. And you can live your life very easily, always reaching for the next thing. Johnny Cash has a song, and it says, talks about the 1 man in 10 who has a satisfied mind. It's the rarest thing to find. Someone who's truly satisfied, someone who is truly content. But it does come from believing that the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I've been reading through the Old Testament. I follow the same Bible reading plan every year. Sounds boring, but actually the way that it works is amazing, because I end up reading the Bible from cover to cover. And God speaks to you through different parts every year, and you just never know what's going to happen. And so this year I've really been struck by the life of Jacob in Genesis. And one of the powerful ways God has transformed the life of Jacob. Jacob grew up with his twin brother Esau in the house of his family, and they were rivals. Esau, his brother, was sort of burly, was tough, was sort of a hunter, worked outside in the wilderness. And the description of Jacob is he was a quiet man who dwelt in tents. And that's okay. We have different pictures of masculinity in the Bible, but it doesn't seem that Jacob was much of a worker. And in fact, more than that, he was a very ambitious and cunning brother. His name actually means he cheats, or he takes one by the heel. And so, as you find often in the Old Testament, the characters, the people, fulfill their names' meaning. And so Jacob cheats his brother out of the inheritance more than once. It creates this strife in the family. His brother Esau has decided he wants to kill him. So this is like serious family dysfunction. And so Jacob has to leave. And what does Jacob find himself doing? He falls in love, and he finds himself working for someone who is a better cheater than he is, his uncle Laban. And he's there for 20 years. And he gets married twice, has a lot of kids, big family. And his life gets more and more complicated because he keeps getting cheated. But he ends up working, as it turns out, working hard as, guess what? A shepherd. But it seems like it's never enough for him. Jacob is living this life of ambition, and he's getting more and more, and he's got more and more children, and he's got more and more livestock, but he's always arguing with his uncle, who is cheating him and is really getting what he's always done his whole life. And he's always wanting more. And eventually he decides, I've got to get out of here. God speaks to him and said, you can go. He escapes from his uncle Laban, and he wants to go back to the family that he left, back to his brother that wanted to kill him 20 years ago. And so on the way back, Jacob is met by a figure in the night. He doesn't know who it is, and this figure wrestles with him. This man wrestles with him and renames him. Jacob won't let go of this man. And this wrestle in Jacob's life really symbolizes everything he's done his whole life. He's been wrestling with man, and now he's wrestling with God. He's trying to make life work out the way that he wants by taking control of it. And it hasn't worked. He's successful, but he always wants more. And suddenly, during that meeting, it turns out that man that he's wrestling with is God himself. It's a very unusual circumstance in the Old Testament. But God blesses him and renames him Israel, not Jacob. His name has changed from being one who cheats and is very ambitious. That's his cheating, his unsatisfaction are all tied up and wrapped together. And he renames him Israel, which is one who strives with God. And this is his character has changed. God has worked with Jacob his whole life, this last 20 years of difficulty to get him to this point. And so finally, after this big, costly, complex adventure that has been his life, he's got a big family now, he's got a lot of wealth, he finally meets the brother that wanted to kill him, and he's fearful. He's fearful that his brother is holding on to a grudge. But eventually he gives this great gift to his brother, many livestock, and he just wants him to know that everything's okay, so he wants to give him this great gift. And this is what Jacob says to his older brother Esau in Genesis 33:11. He says, "Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." You see what's happened? It took more than 20 years. It took his whole life of strife, of God giving him his just desserts, essentially, him being cheated because he was the cheater, to get him to the point where he realized that he has enough because God is enough. And so, good news for you and I this morning is, even if you can't say in your heart, because you're not content, that the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, God's working on you. And he's going to keep working on you, and he's going to work at the reason why you're discontent, your ambition, that you're proud, that you're always looking down at others to build yourself up. He wants to change the inner workings of your heart. And this shepherd that we have is in the process of changing lives. The first thing we've learned is that God is a provider, but his provision is actually, his greatest provision is contentment, a changed soul. Second thing we learn in the text is the shepherd's protection. The shepherd's protection. I've been reading a book, autobiography by a guy called Andy McCarthy. He was the founder of an organisation called Gippsland Solar. He's sort of one of the great success stories from Australian entrepreneurs. It's a bit of a sort of rags to riches story. Started a small company that became very, very large and one of the largest renewable energy companies in Australia by the time he finished up. And it sort of gets to the point in the story where Andy basically has everything. He's had this startup company that's become very successful. He's got people offering to buy it left, right, and centre and give him lots and lots of money. He's got a family. He's fit and reasonably healthy. He's famous. He's getting speaking gigs all around the world. But then he goes for holidays for a month in Spain and comes back and has a panic attack. And he can't shake it. And if anyone's ever had a panic attack, you will know that first one, you think, you don't know what's happening. You are so confused and overwhelmed, you think this is it. And for him, that was just the beginning of a steep downhill journey. Though he had everything, his life was completely turning upside down into full-scale burnout and breakdown because of his overwork. He went from being a confident, ambitious, and successful entrepreneur to being totally unable to work or function, and his body physically began to decline. He was going to renal failure, and all he could do was lie in the fetal position on the ground and hope that the pain was going to go away. He was struck with deep depression and anxiety, and he found it worst at night because as he put his head to the pillow, he would think, I hope I get a good sleep tonight, and that was the end of the sleep. Basically, that's the way it would work night and night again as his spiralling mind took over. But when he was in the darkest place, and the spirals were there, it was often in the dead of night, in the valley of the shadow of death, at least that's how he felt. He just wanted someone to talk to, someone who would listen. And so he would call Beyond Blue every time this happened and just speak to someone. He said that was the thing that got him through. Someone who understood him. Someone who could listen. Someone who could just be with him at his moment of distress. Now, Psalm 23 tells us that these moments will face us, and like Andy, they may come upon us when we least expect it, when we're the most successful we've ever been. We're starting to learn more about burnout and how we can't overwork and kill ourselves because it will literally destroy our mind and body. But you never know when these things are going to come up. But they will. It's guaranteed. It comes with life. Death and taxes are sort of the two promises that we get in this life. But the psalmist has a way to tell us that this need to know someone is with us is answered by God. And just like Andy just needed someone to talk to, someone who could understand and listen, that's the need of our hearts. And Psalm 23 tells us that God is this person. That's what it says. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. You know, the thing that gripped him most was fear. Fear it would never stop. Fear for his family. Fear that perhaps he didn't really have a place in this world. But the psalmist says, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. For your rod and your staff, they comfort me. We have a shepherd who comes to be with his people. David knew this because God had revealed himself to him. He had a good prayer life, it seems, and so that was the way that he exercised his faith and trust that God was with him. God had spoken to him and promised that he would be with him. We have a God who has done more than just what David's experience was. The Bible tells us in the book of Hebrews that we have a high priest who is not unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin, because God became flesh and dwelt among us in the man Jesus Christ. And so there is someone who knows you, there is someone who knows your circumstances, but he knows what it's like to be human too. And in the dark moments, you need someone who knows what it's like, because then they get it. And Jesus gets it. He's been there, and he's been to the valley of the shadow of death, and he's come out the other side. It cost him a lot, though. And so when someone's been there, it gives us confidence that they can care for us in our moment of distress, that they can comfort us, that they can protect us, because Jesus has gone lower than you can ever go. Verse 16 of Hebrews 4 says this: "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." What's the argument of the author of Hebrews? Because Jesus can sympathize with us, yet never sinned, we can always go to him and he will always help us. And so the protection of this good shepherd is there. But it's there in such a deep and personal way because he knows what it's like. He gets it. No other religion has a God who gets it like Jesus does. It's just not there. It's unfathomable that God would become a person, like an actual, real human being, and dwell among us and have a fairly ordinary life in most respects. Yet Jesus has. And so what's the promise of the shepherd? That he will be with his people. You know, there's different ways to deal with depression and anxiety and the fear when you're in the shadow of the valley of death. You know, there's you can take out your bad habits. You can stop drinking, stop smoking, stop, those destructive life habits, stop dating bad people, and get all those things in order. Start eating right, start eating clean. Exercising, everything else. Replacing bad habits with good habits. And there's plenty of books you can read and seminars you can go to that can tell you all about those things. But they can only go so far. Because the valley of the shadow of death is so scary because death is the end. There's only one person that can take you all the way, and that's Jesus. Death is the thing that no habit, improvement, self-help, mindfulness, meditation, or anything else can protect us from. But there is one who can. And so surely then that's the one to go to. Sure, we might need to get a few of our habits sorted out. But if you want to get to the heart, if you want to go deep, you've got to go to Jesus. To truly face dark places without crippling fear, we need the confidence of God's enduring presence. And so the question is then, well, how do we know? How do we know Jesus will stick with us in the darkest places? Because Jesus went there, all the way to the grave. You see, this is a bit hypothetical for us in Psalm 23 because, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he's still walking. Jesus was on a cross. He carried that cross to a place called Golgotha, outside Jerusalem. Falsely accused, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. And Jesus went to that place in order to free us from the very crippling fear that Psalm 23 talks about, the valley of the shadow of death. Jesus was there. On that cross, Jesus said these words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because he was in the very depth of the darkest place in the entire universe, the absence of the presence of God. And he did that so that he could give the fullness of the presence of God. It's been said many times before, and I'll say it again. Jesus took what we deserved to the cross so that he could give us what he deserves. Jesus lived in heaven for all eternity past with the fullness of the Godhead with him. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Didn't need anything. Content in every way. And what does the Bible say? He emptied himself. Became human. Born of flesh, like you and me. And in that place of, letting go of all the provision that he had and living a fairly ordinary human life, he knew that the thing that he had to take away was the sting and the power of death. And so he did. And he did it so these words can be true. Because these words for David needed to be fulfilled. And God himself knew that he would. And so Jesus did. And so what this does for you and I in everyday circumstances is gives us the power to say, even though. That's what David's saying. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, even if I never get married, even if I never have kids, even if this sickness gets worse or this chronic illness continues, even if I don't get the job I always wanted, even if I'm not as good as my sister or brother, because sibling rivalries, exists once you become an adult too, unfortunately, we know. Even though I haven't done what I wanted to do in my life, even though I've messed up a bunch of times and I keep doing it. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So we've learnt the shepherd's provision and we've learnt the shepherd's protection. Lastly, I want to tell you about the shepherd's house. We get this in verses 5 and 6, the shepherd's house. He wants to invite them in. I've been reading a book by Joni Eareckson. Now, Joni is a woman. Her name is spelt Joni, but she's named after her father, and so she insists her name is pronounced Johnny, so I'm going to call her Joni. Joni Eareckson grew up in a loving family in the US in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And at 17 years old, she really had been living a blessed life. She recalls her family going on these amazing, 100-mile adventures on horseback. The parents were loving and kind. She describes her, dad as never getting angry. And I think, is that actually possible for a parent never to get angry? But anyway, that's what she says. She was an honours student, so she had just finished the equivalent of Year 12, honours student. She was the captain of her lacrosse team. Her life was brimming with potential. Although I'd say she was in a Christian family, but her faith, she knew, was distant from God. She was in a relationship with a young man who she shouldn't have been. They were sexually active. She kept trying to, not do it, and she kept doing it. In fact, she even prayed to God one time and said, Lord, anything to get me to stop doing this. It's a dangerous prayer to pray. One summer day in 1976, she jumped into a bay where everyone was enjoying their summer, off a jetty, and cracked her spine and was face down in the water, conscious, but she couldn't move. That 17-year-old Johnny, at that day became a quadriplegic from the shoulders down. Where was the blessing of the shepherd's house for the 17-year-old quadriplegic? Because the Bible and Psalm 23 promises us that goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. I want you to hold that thought.
What are the promises in our text for coming into the house of the shepherd? The shepherd has been caring for you your whole life. The shepherd wants you to come home. That's the invitation of God, is he wants you. He wants you in heaven with him forever. That is an open invitation. You want to come, he's got it for you. He's made the way. Jesus has paid the penalty. The door is open. Walk in, believe. And this is what's in the house. It says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Imagine a beautiful banquet, and there's no enemy that can take it away. No one can stop this banquet. You anoint my head with oil. The anointing of oil in the Old Testament was a sign of consecration, of cleanness, of moral cleanness, of spiritual cleanness. You are without sin, clean, white as snow in the presence of God, and nothing to hide, nothing to fear. My cup overflows. It is a place of abundance, of entire fulfillment, satisfaction, and contentment forever. It is a place, they're called the two sheepdogs, of goodness and mercy. Chase after you. That word mercy is from the Hebrew word hesed, which actually means covenant faithfulness. It's saying that God is faithful to his covenant for his people. He loves them, even at great cost to himself, and he will follow your life with these things. And there's a promise, of course, all the days of my life it will continue. This is in advance of this beautiful house, this dwelling place of the shepherd, this table set before you, this invitation that's coming, is that while you're waiting for it, goodness and mercy shall follow you all the days of your life, because you have an unshakable hope that you will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Sounds good. I hope it sounds good this morning. Do we feel like that for people like Johnny? Do we feel like that when we're in the valley of the shadow of death? This text is calling us to reorientate our thinking. To reorientate our thinking. To actually not look at our life with what we don't have, but look at our life with what we do have. And to look at the most important things first. This invitation is calling to you this morning. How will you respond? Well, I think the first way that you should respond is to change your hindsight. To change your hindsight. This is what I mean. David, who wrote this, who came out of his own experience, as we've discussed, knew that he had been anointed the king of Israel by the prophet Samuel. He was getting ready to be king, and yet on his way getting ready to be king, he was getting chased and persecuted. He lived as a mercenary, had to do things he never wanted to do. He had to live in caves in the wilderness. There's all sorts of manner of things that he had never wanted to do in his life, and he was supposed to be king. He had a long time to wait. His life was constantly under threat, and yet God had anointed him. God had said, you will be king. This was a promise of future blessing and position. And so what did this mean? He would look to what God has done and say, no, I will live in light of God's promise, not in light of my circumstances. I will live in light of God's promises, not in light of my circumstances. The way that I think about my life will be controlled by my trust in God. And so as David is writing this song for you and I to read today, many thousands of years later, he's rewriting his story. He's saying, even though I've been dwelling in caves, my life's been under threat, I've been highly stressed and anxious the last 10 plus years. I'm supposed to be the king, but I'm living as a mercenary in a foreign country, doing things that is like the worst possible life I could have imagined. I'm trusting God. Because you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Even with little, His heart was filled because he was trusting the spiritual promises of God. And so how much more do the Christian co-heirs of Christ have this powerful anointing that we share with the King of the universe? How much more? In Johnny's description of her life, as she describes her accident when at 17 she dived in, she goes blow by blow almost as her face is sort of like on the sand. She's holding her breath, but she can't move. She doesn't know what's going on. And she remembers that in that moment, she felt a sense of unusual peace. And as she's recounting this, many years, decades later, she said God gave her a grace in that moment of his peace, that he was with her. Now, if I had been paralyzed from the shoulders down and couldn't use my arms and legs, and I looked back to the moment that happened, would I be looking for God's grace? Wow, that is a good question. And I can't answer that honestly right now. But this is what it does. When you really believe this, you rewrite your history. You're not looking for all the bad things that have happened to me and joining the self-pity that will make you feel worse and worse and worse. You're looking for the goodness and mercy of God. And so that's what she did. And you know the psalm that came to mind as she was in the hospital, not able to feel her arms or legs? It was this one. And she said to herself, as the medic was with her, as she was driven to the hospital with the most life-changing event a 17-year-old could possibly have, she said to herself, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. For your rod and your staff, they comfort me." And she said these words, believing and trusting that they would come to pass. "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." In 2014, she wrote a song to a biography, a movie about her life, and she performed it herself with her husband, Ken, pushing on her diaphragm while they recorded the song to give her enough breath to hit the high notes. And one of the lines in the lyrics say this: "I'm alone, yet not alone. God's the light that will guide me home. With his love and tenderness leading through the wilderness, and wherever I may roam, I'm alone, yet not alone." And so this morning, let me encourage you, take these words to heart. Remember that Jesus is this good shepherd. Be thankful. Let me pray.